All right, well, it is that time, and like I said, we missed our really cool music for those of you that have been on the sessions earlier this week. But anyway, again, I'd like to welcome you. I'm Liz Stahl. I'm Extension Educator in Crops with University of Minnesota Extension, and I'd like to welcome you today to the last of our webinar series, Essential Rural Crop Management, a socially distant webinar series for spring of 2020. So again, just a reminder, this is a collaborative effort with our colleagues at Iowa State University Extension and Outreach and University of Minnesota Extension. Special thank you to Megan Anderson and Angie Reich-Hintz at Iowa State for working with us, and that includes Phyllis Bongard, Lisa Benken, and myself in pulling this webinar series together. For those of you that have been on earlier this week, welcome back. And if this is your first session, glad you could join us today. Again, just the housekeeping details. If you have any questions, please do enter those into that Q&A box. You can enter that at any time. So if they pop up during the session, please do enter those and we will address those at the end of the presentation. If you do have any technical issues, please enter those in the chat box and we'll see if we can help you out with that. So again, the chat box is for technical issues, but questions, please use a Q&A. And also like to remind you, we do have recordings of all these sessions. This session will also be recorded. They will be posted onto the U of M Extension website. Also, there's a SciBox account with Iowa State, and that is posted in the chat box. So you can find the links to that and also how to self-report for CEUs. So again, I will introduce then our speaker today, Jody DeYoung-Hughes. She's an extension educator in water resources with the University of Minnesota Extension, talking about tillage options for this spring. So Jody, I'll take it to you there. If you want to get your presentation loaded up.
Yep. Okay. Go to slideshow. Okay. Is it looking the right way?
Yep, looks good.
Okay. Okay. Well, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. And this seems to be a topic for quite a few states. If you didn't get your fall tillage done, don't panic. Now, this is only about 15-20 minutes, and so I can only touch on a few things. And if you have any questions, I'll definitely answer them at the end. I'll stay on as long as you guys need. And there's my contact info if you need to get a hold of me. So, you know, base your spring tillage on what your available equipment is, the crop that you are growing, the one that you just got out of, you know, are you going corn to beans, beans to corn, is wheat in there? Your soil texture, when you have the lighter soils, you can definitely do a lot less tillage than if you have the heavier clay soils. And these are probably things that you already know, but like some of the farmers around us, they farm heavy clays and their lighter sands. And what they do is they have equipment for the heavier clays. Well, now you can look at those sands a little differently, and it can also save you a lot of money. Are you on a slope? You need a lot less tillage on slopes, if no till. And you know, what are the economics of all of this? So vertical till, I've had farmers calling me up and they say, well, there's this different equipment out there. They'll name off, you know, Kuhn Krause. Well, all of them have different equipment out right now. And basically what vertical till is something that goes into the soil vertically, not horizontally. And it's classified by NRCS as a mulch till. It does leave quite a lot of residue left afterwards, but it does kind of the slicey dicey action. So it throws things up and down, and it's really good at chopping. It's usually shallow, 1 to 3 inches. So you can set it to how aggressive you want it to be. And so the picture on the right is a gang. You could pitch this gang to be more or less aggressive. The one on the left are individually mounted wavy coulters. But the basic thing about vertical till is that these are straight up and down. There's no concavity to them. And like I said, it chops residue really, really well. But do not think it's going to incorporate your urea. So if you put urea on the top, it better be stabilized, because all it does is throw things up into the air and they come right back down, and they don't get covered very well. So, you know, don't put on your nitrogen that way. If it's, now there's different things that can happen in a really wet soil, it does fantastic. It's one of the only things that doesn't plug up, and as long as your tractor can get through the soil, that piece of equipment can too. But in a really dry soil, since there's no shank in there to pull it down into the soil and hold it there, it bounces along the top of the soil. So if you go and you get out from behind the tractor and you brush away the soil, you don't have to brush away much because it doesn't go very deep. You can see that it can it can really miss a lot of tillage. If it's really dry, it won't break into that sidewall. Same with this one here. I see it quite often in very dry soil. So if you have a really dry soil and you want it to do soil tillage, it won't do it. If you want it to cut residue, it will do good. Field cultivator, these are tried and true. You know, we've had this around for, well, years and years and years. And what it does is if you look back at this one here, is the soil comes up along it and turns over. It also goes to the side and flips over. So it does a lot better with incorporating weeds and incorporating your fertilizers. And it's good for a drier soil, but on a wet soil, it can be very detrimental because you have that flat metal surface. It can cause a pan. And if you're pulling it at 3 inches and you plant your corn seed at 2, you got only baby roots trying to get through this plow pan here. If it gets wet, this pan won't be a problem. But if it stays dry, it will turn into a brick. And you know you can't support a corn plant on a couple inches of rooting system there. So it's better to have vertical till in a wet soil and field cultivator in a dry soil. Strip till, if you're doing this, is getting more and more popular, although it's been around about 15 years, a little bit longer. And so what you're doing is you're taking the coulter, cutting the residue, you take the trash whippers, push it to the side. There's a shank behind here that can put down NPK, and then you have your berming discs that create a nice berm. And you can have a rolling basket or not, it's up to you if you have that or not. If you're doing it in the spring, I would recommend it. If you're doing it in the fall, I wouldn't recommend a rolling basket. So in the springtime, and then you come back in and you plant right back on top of it. Now, if you have a shank on the system, I would not use it in the spring. We have done that in some of our research trials, and we try to shallow it up. And if the soil is in good working condition, it's okay. But if it's wet, we've smeared it and we've left a pocket, you know, and it's really bad, and the poor plant's trying to grow through that. So if you if you do have one of these and you could take out the shank and you put in double coulters, then this works really well on the sandier soils and also in wet conditions and in the spring. Points and shanks, what they do is they lift and separate the soil. They go through the soil and the soil goes up and over, and it separates more along its natural plane, so it does less damage to the soil structure. And so with the field cultivator, chisel plow, the things like that. But spring chisel plow, you really most of the time don't think of that. You don't want to take those shanks into the soil, and that's very true. You don't want to run them at 6 to 8 inches, but you can shallow them up. You can change the points that you have on there, and it can actually be a pretty good conservation tillage tool. And there are many, many different points out there that you can use, and they disturb the soil differently. So the wider it is, the more soil it's going to disturb. The more that has a twist in it or parabolic, it's going to, or a curve in it, it's going to just move more soil. And it can have a chance of smearing. So here's a difference between a twisted shovel and a sweep. A sweep left a lot more residue out there, but a sweep can also, kind of like a field cultivator, leave a smeared area. So again, you got to know your soil moisture conditions. I would have written this just, or for wet soils, but there are places that are drying out now, and in a couple of weeks, who knows, that you could be very dry. So I'm showing you both sides of what this tillage equipment can do. If you have a disc, I'm not very fond of discs. They were great at chopping residue, but we have vertical till to do that. So discs have a curve in them. They're not vertical till, they have a curve. And usually they're pretty big. We do have shallow discs, and we have these very large ones. And the thing about the disc versus a shank or a point is that it tells the soil where to cut and separate, and it really destroys a lot more structure. And you'll see these on the side of the road when they're putting in a new road bed. There'll usually be a disc there. I was going to say wishing disc, a disc there. And the reason why is because it cuts up the soil and grinds it up and makes the individual particles. It makes a really good road bed, but you don't want that in your field. you don't want a road bed in your field. And so the only place I really like to use discs is when you're creating a road. Well, okay, so say you have all this residue and you really don't know what tool to bring in there. And we've had years where people have been burning. Burning has its pros and cons, a lot of cons. And the main ones is you're going to lose your nitrogen. It's going to go back up to the atmosphere. You're going to lose carbon or turn it into a source that microbes cannot use. And you're going to lose your P and K are going to turn to ash. And if it actually gets hot enough and burns the residue well. And so these are the typical numbers of nutrients that you can lose: about 38 pounds of nitrogen, 14 pounds of phosphorus, and 96 pounds of potassium per acre. If you do burn and you get a pretty good burn, you can actually plant right into it without doing any tillage. So if you're going to burn and do tillage, that's going to be pretty detrimental to your soil health. The other thing is make sure that the wind is not blowing into towns. We did in Herman, Minnesota, have a few car accidents the last time that this was pretty popular in the fall when they couldn't get the residue taken care of. So just keep that in mind when you're burning. It may sound like the best thing, but if you burn, don't till. So if you had ruts left over from last fall, or like if you're in northern Minnesota, you could be creating them right now, trying to harvest and get everything out. And so we did a study on 7 different fields. We flagged where we had rutted them up in the fall and came back and in the springtime, and we did stand counts and we had the farmers just fill them in like they would regular tillage. So 6 of them were chisel plow with a spring field cultivation, and 1 was a disc ripper with a field cultivation. And then we went out there and we compared, what happened in the rut and what happened 2 rows over where there was no rutting. And we had to hand harvest all of this because I couldn't ask the farmers to, combine 1 row at a time. So this is what some of them had looked like, and we would put, we'd fill it in with tillage. And then we would put our flag here. We GPSed them. We had penetrometers. We knew where these were. And then we went over 2 rows and flagged there. And that's where we took our harvests from and our stand counts. So in the areas that they didn't have that rutted wheel traffic, you can see that they had pretty good stand there. The ears, the yield. Where they did have the ruts, you can see that you have, they're not filling to the tip. They're smaller. You also had more zipper ears. Everywhere we went, we definitely showed a big difference there. Now our stand and our grain moisture did not differ whether you were in ruts or not ruts, but the average height when we went out there, we saw that it was 31 inches where there weren't any ruts and 22 inches. So yes, that was statistically significant that the plants were shorter in the ruts, and they were also behind in a vegetative stage. And usually with corn, if you're more than 1 V stage behind, you kind of consider that one a weed. And then we got our yields, and they were difference by 17%. And that was really consistent across all 7 sites. It was kind of amazing. And if you take 27 bushel, and you times it by 3, you're losing a lot in those rutted areas. That's not per acre. I was going to say that's just where we rutted. So let's say you rutted up 10% of your acreage, then you would take it and multiply it by that. In our soybean data, I didn't think ahead very well that all that corn was going to be put into soybeans the following year. So I don't have 2nd year corn data, which I could have kicked myself. So here's the soybean data. And again, there was no difference in stand or the grain moisture, but where we didn't have ruts, they were taller, and they were ahead in growth stages by 2 growth stages, and they were also ahead in their reproductive stage. And it did come out to yield. The problem was this year was extremely dry, 2011. This was, and I lost some of my sites from harvest because the moisture of the soybeans dropped to 8% in like a day. And so all of the farmers were out combining, and before I could get out there and hand harvest the soybeans. So we did get 4 of them, 4 of the 7 plots. And there is, again, a 16% yield decrease. So you will see this for a while. Now on the third year, I went out there and went to the GPS areas, took out a penetrometer, tried to find where the harder area was, the compacted area, and couldn't find it. Now 10, 11, and 12 were more in the drier cycles. And so we didn't see anything past 2 years. If it's wet, I would expect that we would have seen more issues. So, you know, these ruts last a couple of years, 2 to 4, I would give you. And also the same with compaction and tillage passes. So every spring, probably not this one, but every spring I go up into an airplane and I look at the fields and this is what I see. So my husband's a farmer or used to farm, and when we would see uneven corn, he would say, oh, that corn's really uneven out there. And then when it got really tall and you couldn't see past the second row from the road, he would say, oh, look, it all evened up. It's not. You take a drone up, you now have the capability of doing that. But here you can see the tillage passes, you can see tractor passes, combine passes. There's all sorts of tracks in this field. And this is not unique. It happens everywhere. I have a very hard time trying to find fields that have not been trafficked, that don't show all the patterns in them. So just take a drone up, you can see it. I can also tell when you've been out there with an ATV trying to clean out your tile lines too. That shows up too. So you can see here, it goes into the fields even back here. It's everywhere. I can't overemphasize how many fields are like this. So, well, okay, if I reduce my tillage, my yields are going to suffer because I have, I have all that residue. I'm going to show you a little bit of research, but at the end, I'll give you a website that you can go to look at all our research that we have on this. So looking at 4 site years that are between Fergus Falls and Wahpeton, and we're looking at soybeans, and these are the average of all of the 2 sites and the 2 years. We have a strip till with a shank that had 48 bushel an acre, strip till with a coulter, 49, vertical till, 48, chisel plow, 48. 1 bushel difference between all of these, no statistical difference. Well, let's look over into North Dakota. They're cooler, they're wetter, and these are in eastern North Dakota, not over in the west. And when you looked at 17 site years, what you would find is that 76% of the time, soybeans didn't care what kind of tillage you used. I just love soybeans. They'll just let you do almost anything to them and they still yield pretty good. 18% of the time they like strip till better than no-till or any of the other tillage methods that we used. And then 6% of the time chisel plow out yielded the rest, but only 6% of the time in 17 sites. Well, let's go to corn because corn is more particular than soybeans. And you can see that strip till with a shank was 180, strip till with a coulter done in the springtime. The shanks are done in the fall, 186, vertical till 184, chisel plow 185. The reason why strip till with a shank is at 180 is because 1 year we could not get it in at the same time as the other ones, and it rained in between. Then we went with strip till and we smeared the soil. So we were out there when it wasn't ideal conditions and it brought down our yield. It's not the fault of the equipment, it was human error on that one. So they all, if you looked at the other years, they yielded very, very consistently. So if they're going to give you the same yield, you need to look at the economics. So looking at North Dakota, again, 44% no difference on what kind of tillage you use, including no-till. And 44% of the time they did like a little tillage with strip till, and only 12% of the time with chisel plow. And this is 18 site years. Again, weather plays more of a role than the equipment that we use. I think we've overestimated what tillage actually does for us. Everything has changed, the different types of equipment, different planters, different hybrids, different everything. And so I think it's time to look at our tillage again. In 2004, we had 13 site years, and Liz helped with this site here. And it was, we had no-till, strip till in the gold, field cultivation, 1 field cultivation pass in the spring, and then a chisel plow with a field cultivation, chisel plow fall, spring field cultivation. And what we found is that you see this little star, it shows that no-till did have a lower yield than the other 3 types of tillage. The reason why is 2004 was a very cool and wet year. This is also only first year no-till. What we found in 2005, going to different fields, they yielded the same. There was no statistical difference between the 4 different ones. So if you look at no-till, then, you know, without paying the price of tillage, you could actually get the same yields on nice, beautiful growing conditions. Well, tell me the weather and I'll tell you how to farm. It kind of comes down to that. But if you look here, no-till had 59% residue, strip-till had 47, just one field cultivation pass in the spring on soybean residue brought it down to 29% residue, and the chisel plow down to 22. But the basic thing this spring is get that planter set up. You know, get the residue managers out there. If you don't have them, you know, maybe you want to, you know, invest into this and sharpen your coulters, your discs, get everything in the best working order. You only have one chance to get that seed in the ground. And from then on, it's, you know, it's more Mother Nature what's going to happen. So you want to get everything in working order, spend the next few weeks really getting that planter into shape. It means more than anything else right now. So if you use shallow tillage, or if you're going to go out and do tillage this spring, make sure it's really light tillage, shallow it up, don't make it very aggressive. And if you're in wet soil, use a vertical till. If you're in dry soil, use the field cultivator. And soybeans can yield well without tillage. They're really good at working in no-till. And if you're not tilling, you're going to save yourself 10, which is a field cultivation pass, up to $40, which is moldboard plow, which I really hope you're not going to do that in the spring. And you can save up to $40 by not doing that. And again, get out from behind the planter frequently in the field and check behind and see what it's doing with the seed. You only have one chance there. So this is the tillage guide I was talking about that shows the last 15 years of data in Minnesota and to North Dakota. And then again, there's my contact information. If you want to know more about soil management and soil health, you can come to our summit. That will be in Mankato, December 15th and 16th.
All right, thank you, Jody. Some really cool pictures there too. I hadn't seen those pictures of the aerial photos that you had. But again, so we'll open this up for questions. Again, you can just enter those in that Q&A box if there's anything that you would like to ask Jody at this time. And again, a reminder, anybody who needs CEU credits, we do have that, how to self-certify, how to send those in. That's in also the chat box, and also links to resources like Jody mentioned. There'll be some links in there. I do have some questions here, but again, just again, feel free to enter some more. Just curious, one question would be for any of the prevent plant or drown out spots this year, since there were a lot of those in some fields, any special considerations that you would offer for those?
For the drown out spots?
Yeah, like where I'm assuming where they didn't have anything, you know, 'cause some people use a lot of tillage, for example, you know, so nothing was growing there. Any special recommendations? Be really low residue probably in those spots.
Yeah, there would be hardly any residue there. I would probably just hit it with something really light, like even vertical till, just to kind of, because it's probably crusted, especially with the snow that sat on it, you know, probably pressed everything down. So even a harrow, just go over with a spring tooth harrow and just get it ready for planting. You don't need to do a lot of tillage there at all. But if you're going into corn, then Liz, like, you know, you may have black fallow syndrome depending when it drown out. And if you're going into corn, make sure you use more phosphorus in that area.
Yep. And banding of the phosphorus too. Broadcast won't do it, right? So band of phosphorus and zinc. Yep. But okay, and here's a question from Chris. What are your thoughts on a high-speed disc for spring tillage on corn stubble that was not worked in the fall of 2019? Do you expect the same issues as a regular disc?
Staying shallow with it. What kind of disc was it again, Liz?
But a high-speed disc, that's just what I have here.
I would run it shallow, and yeah, discs are really good at cutting up residue and piecing it so that the planter could get through there a lot better. Like I said, I'm not a really big disc fan, but if you have a lot of residue out there and you can't get a planter through there, then definitely the disc will go through and it will chop it up nice. Just introduce a little bit of soil on top. It will help break it down. And yeah, it should work for you.
Okay. Thank you, Jody. And here's another one, grain carts. Like, again, you showed some really cool photos of tillage passes. Well, we're assuming all tillage passes. Could some of those be due to grain carts? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, grain cart is usually the heaviest item that you have out there. And if you have a 1,200 bushel grain cart, you can be putting around 36 tons an axle load down onto the soil, which can compact the soil down to 3 feet. So we didn't, it's kind of hard to go back and change what we did in the fall. It's not kind of hard, it's impossible, isn't it? But what you can do is next year, if it's really wet like that and maybe you're forming ruts, unload at the entrance of the field, because having to go back and fill those in and deal with compaction for years and years, it's worth the time to empty at the end of the field and not on the go. So grain carts are the worst. You want to control the traffic there because about 80% of the compaction happens on the first pass. So if you can line it up with the combine, so you have the combine go through and make the most of the compaction, then when the combine's over here and you are going to unload on the go, run in the old combine tracks and then take it to the end of the field. Don't go out at a diagonal with a full tank, and end of the field and follow it to the headlands. That's all compacted anyway.
Okay. And I have another question here. If I have ruts from this fall, you know, again, challenging fall in a lot of areas, what might be the best way to work them this spring?
It depends on the depth of them. So if they're shallow and they're not very consistent, and see, I was going to write an article on this, but there's a lot of variables. Okay, if you are no-till or have very good structure in your soil and you probably have ruts only in certain little spots, just hit those certain little spots. Don't go through the rest of the field. You're going to have a yield hit, but you don't want to destroy the structure that you've built up over the years. If you have full field tillage and you have shallow ruts, then you can fill them in with a vertical till. So if they're less than 4 inches or so, vertical till and field cultivation will fill them in, and so will a shallow disc. And kind of vertical till might not do as well unless you pitch the gang to be a little more aggressive, because then it will throw the soil into the rut, whereas straight vertical till won't throw soil very well. If it's deeper than 4 inches, you're going to need to go in there with something deeper than 4 inches, like a chisel plow. But then again, if you can go in there with something that's not very aggressive, but just has the depth so that you can get that rut filled in, that's what you want to do. If you buried the tractor or the grain cart or the combine, fill in those areas with whatever you got to fill them in, but don't use that on the whole field. Just spot treat as best as you can. The more tillage you do, the more you break apart the structure. And the structure is your number one defense against more compaction. So those little aggregates, they act like mini columns in the soil and they help hold up the weight of equipment. So do the roots of cover crops, and so does some residue. So the deeper you till to try to take out what you think is going to be those ruts, and you know, like they're at 6 inches, I'm going to go 10. Now you destroyed the structure from 6 to 10 inches. And the next year you can sink down to 10 inches instead of just 6.
Okay, I've got one last question. I think we can squeak this one in here for the end here. Lots of people talking about no tillage, but I am concerned about placement, fertilizer placement being an issue. I'm assuming probably nitrogen is the biggest one. How can I make sure I don't lose yield if I go to no-till corn?
Okay, so you would need to put it on your side dress it is one way. Also have it on the planter so that you could do a starter or a pop-up. Of course, you can't put down all of it that way, but side dress is your main way of getting it under the surface, or you put down a stabilized urea and hope it rains.
Okay.
So it is a little bit more of a challenge. Well, it's a lot more of a challenge to put down nitrogen with no-till. So it needs a little bit more timely. You know, you got to be able to side dress, and sometimes rains don't always let us do that. That's why I kind of like strip till, is because you band apply it down below and it's safer there and it won't volatilize anyway.
All right. Well, thank you, Jody. All right. And we are just close to our timer, so I'm going to wrap things up here again. If you do think of any other questions, Jody has her contact information there. I'm sure she's more than happy to address anything if you want to send her an email. But again, thanks for attending our webinar series. Again, a reminder, if you missed any of the ones earlier, these have all been recorded, or if you want to catch anything again, they are available in the SciBox account. We have that link in the chat. And also, we have resources that are available in that SciBox account. Now, note you'll all be getting, should all be getting an email with a follow-up evaluation survey. We really do appreciate your input on this. Should be a really short survey, just a few questions, but we are looking for your input just to see, what did you think of this series? This is kind of a new little thing for us to do, these short webinars like this. Do you like this time frame, like the topics? But again, appreciate your feedback on that. And with that, I will thank you all for attending and being with our socially distant webinar series for this spring. So stay healthy, everyone, and have an excellent weekend.